Hi everyone, today we're going to have a look at a simple animation using MoDynamics and MoSoftBodies, and you can see in this video here we're going to do this net-like structure which is made up of spheres, and if I hit play you can see at the beginning of the animation this net-like structure falls down a bit, it relaxes, and as soon as it's in its final position we'll have this spheres fall down and hit that net and bounce off of it. You will need at least broadcast to be able to follow along. If you are working with release 21, there is only the studio version, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you are using an older version of Cinema 4D, I'm still on release 18, you will need either broadcast or the studio version to be able to follow along. So let's jump right into Cinema 4D and get started. First of all, we're going to set up the basic animation and then we're going to tweak it to get the look that we want. We're going to start this with a sphere, and I'm going to change the radius to something smaller, like 10 or 11. We could speed up the calculations by reducing the segments on the sphere, but I think in this case it's not going to be necessary because we won't have that many objects in the scene. I'm going to switch that to Guru shading to get rid of the lines here. And I'm going to put this sphere in a cloner, and we'll set the cloner to a grid array, and let's give this maybe 11 by 1 by 11 clones, and I want to space these apart a little bit further, so let's do 225 maybe. And let's use the same size on the z-axis. So we've got something like this. And right now, if I hit the play button, nothing is going to happen because these spheres are not dynamic yet. So let's make them dynamic by adding a simulation tag. First of all, though, I'm going to rename the cloner to net and the sphere to net sphere so we can tell things apart. Let's select the cloner, right click, go to simulation tags, and we need a rigid body tag. So now if I hit play, the spheres will fall down into oblivion, which of course is not what we want. What I want is to pin this net structure using the 4 corner spheres. And we can do that with a MoGraph Selection. So let's go to MoGraph and MoGraph Selection, and maybe I'll do that in the top view, and I'm going to select the 4 corner spheres by holding down Shift, and you can see we now have a MoGraph Selection tag. So let's see what happens now, and you can see that we're getting the same effect as before. And what we need to change is we need to go to the MoGraph Selection tag and invert the selection. Now let's see what happens. Well, we're still getting the same result. And the reason is because we need to set up the Dynamics tag in order for this to work. On the Dynamics tag, we need to go to the Soft Body tab over here and switch soft bodies to, or the soft body option to made of clones. And now if I hit play, I'm still not getting the desired result, and that is because we need to tell the Dynamics tag to use the MoGraph Selection. And we can do that on the Dynamics tab, and we need to add the selection to the Dynamics here. So we need to put it in this slot. So let's go ahead and drag the MoGraph Selection in there. And now the 4 corner spheres should be static and the rest should be dynamic. Let's hit play and see what happens. And you can see we're already getting a pretty nice looking result. We're going to tweak this a little bit later. So what I also want is another sphere that falls down from the top into this net here. So let's go ahead and create another sphere. And I'm going to scale this down to maybe 40%. And let's move this up. And if I hit play, nothing will happen to that sphere up here because it also needs to be dynamic for this to work. Because I have broadcast, I can't just add a simulation tag. In this case, we need another rigid body tag. If you have the studio version, it's enough to add the rigid body tag to the sphere and that will make it dynamic. But in the broadcast version, I only have MoDynamics and MoSoftBody, so I need to use these features in connection with the MoGraph tools. So what I need to do is put this sphere in a cloner, and I only need one sphere, and I can apply a simulation tag, in this case a rigid body tag, to that cloner, and that will make that sphere dynamic, as you can see. I'm going to rename this to collision sphere, and let's just copy that and rename the sphere as well. So let's have a look at what we have so far. So this is not looking too good yet. Let's go ahead and make some changes. For one thing, I don't want this sphere to fall down immediately. So let's go back to the beginning of the timeline, and I'll just switch that collision sphere dynamics off for now. What I want is for this net to settle, and then I want that sphere to fall down. With the settings that we have right now, this seems to be the case at around frame 70. But before I make a final decision on the frame at which I want the collision sphere to start falling down, I'm going to tweak that net a little bit further. So let's go to the dynamics tag of the net and let's play around with the soft body settings. One thing I would like to achieve is I want to have this net fall down a little bit further and be a little bit more elastic maybe. So let's try and change the structural parameter. Let's bring this down to maybe about 50 or so and see what effect that has. And I think that is looking a little bit better. And you can play around with all of the other settings as well. There is no right or wrong really. You just need to play around with these parameters to get the look and feel that you're after. So structural seems to have the effect that I want. Okay, that's looking good. We could also try and play with the damping. I'm not even sure what some of these settings really mean. This one doesn't seem to do anything really. So I'll just reset it to the default. And sometimes it's useful to use extreme values for your parameters. Like for the elastic limit, we could bring this up and see if anything happens, or bring it down and see if anything happens, but this doesn't seem to have an effect either. So let's play around with the shear, see if that does anything. Let's reset that. It does look a little more loose than before, I think. So I'm going to keep this at 1 or maybe even at 0. So this is looking nice. And one thing you could do if you want to make this a little more springy, you could go down to the stiffness here and bring that up. And small numbers can have a big effect with respect to stiffness. So even if I change it to 6 only, you can see it's a lot more springy and doesn't fall down as much as it did before. I prefer this look here. So let's stop this animation And I'm also going to add a few frames to the timeline. Let's go for 180. And if I hit Control D, I can go to my project settings. You can see I have 30 frames per second. And if I go to my render settings under output, you can see I have a frame rate of 30 frames here as well. And I'm going to stick with that. If you want to use different frame rates like 24, just make sure that you have the same settings in the render settings that you have in the project settings. So let's have a look again. And I think at around frame 60, this net has settled enough, and I want that other sphere to fall down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to frame 60, select the dynamics tag of the collision sphere, go to the dynamics tab, and I'm going to set a keyframe with dynamics disabled. And then we can go one frame forward, enable dynamics, and set another keyframe. And maybe this takes a little bit too long to fall down. So let's just go back. I'll just move this down a little bit further. I do want to move it up a little bit more because at the beginning I don't want this to be visible in the viewport. So let's see. Okay, this is looking okay, but the sphere is looking like it's almost floating and not really falling down. So what we can do is in the dynamics tag, we can go to mass and change the world density to maybe custom density. And let's give this a higher number. Let's try 100 and see what happens. And you can see the sphere is going right through that net, so that means the density is a little bit too high. Let's bring this down to 10. And this will make that sphere look a little heavier. And 10 is still too much. Let's try 3 or 4. And it looks like that is still too much. So let's bring this down to 2. Okay, and that is working a little bit better. But it doesn't look very nice quite yet. So what can we do? Let's see. I'm going to select both of these dynamics tags, and on the collision tab, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the bounce to 20 or 30 and bring the friction up. So that is looking a little bit better. And let's see what happens if we bring that shear back up a little bit again. Let's make this a little stiffer, maybe. No, I don't like that. We could reduce the structure. It could bounce a little bit more, I think. So I'm going to change the bounce value for the collision sphere back to 40. And let's also change the amount of bounce on the net itself. Okay, so that's looking good. Let's go ahead and switch on lines here, and for the net sphere I'm going to change those segments back to 6 because I want to show you something. And you can see that when this collision sphere hits these spheres on the net, there is a lot of erratic movement here, and I don't really want that. So it's not really going to be visible, because when we render, it's still going to be perfect spheres, and if we don't put, I don't know, checkerboard textures or anything on them, you won't even be able to see that. But what we can do to change that is we can again go to the Dynamics tag, and let's go to the Force tab. And what we can do here is we can change the follow position, follow rotation. In this case, they're not really moving, but they're rotating a lot. So I'm going to bring this up to 10. Let's see what happens. Still too much movement. Usually for the animations that I do, a follow rotation value of between 5 and 10 is enough, but in this case we need to crank this up a little bit more. So let's see what happens if we make this 50. And you can see we're getting a lot less movement, but you can also see there is some jitter. Can you see that? On that sphere right below the collision sphere. Now we could try and also use linear damping and angular damping, and basically what these two do is they take some of the energy out of the animation, and in this particular case that's not really what I want. So what we can also try and do to fix this issue here is hit Ctrl D to go to the project settings, and here under the Dynamics tab we have some settings for the dynamics, and we want to go to the Expert tab, and here we can change a few things. Now in this case I'm going to bring the collision margin down to 0.1. That's not going to have an effect on the jittering, it's just making the collision a little bit more accurate. What we can do to make the calculation of the simulation more accurate and prevent this jittering from happening is we can increase the steps per frame and the iterations. So let's go ahead and just increase the steps per frame to say 10. Hit play. And you can see we're not getting this jitter anymore. The spheres are moving around a little bit, which I think is fine. And this is looking a lot better, I think. We could also try and increase the maximum solver iterations if we wanted to. Depending on your simulation, the result may look quite different if you do that. Now bringing the iterations up doesn't seem to do a lot really. We could try and do 20 steps per frame. Yeah, not a big improvement. Let's go for 10. And you can see I'm still getting around 30 frames here with the Camtasia software running in the background, which is not too bad. Without Camtasia running in the background, I got about 100 frames or so, I think. So in any case, this is looking a little bit better. Now let's go ahead and play around with that sphere. I want to try and increase that mass a little bit and see if it still breaks through that net. Yeah, it does. So maybe we can change that net and bring the structure value up a little bit and see if that has an effect. Yeah, let's increase that to maybe around 50. Maybe 60. So that's looking pretty good, I think. Now let's play with the elastic limit and see if that has any effect when something collides with that sphere. What I mean is when the sphere collides with the net. Does this look different? Let's bring this up to 2000. See if there's any difference. And I think there is. The sphere is stretching that net a little bit more. And I think that's looking pretty good. And I'm going to stick with that. I'm going to change that friction to about 90 and bring the bounce down. And you can play around with that all day long. So yeah, I think that is looking pretty nice. The only thing that I don't really like, but that has changed. Maybe that's because of some of the settings we changed, because at the beginning the sphere took way too long to fall down. So maybe that's because we changed the mass of the sphere, made it heavier, so it accelerates faster. In any case, I think the animation is looking pretty good as it is now. So let's go ahead and change those segments back to 24 and switch the lines off. And let's add some textures and a bit of lighting maybe. So I'm going to double click in the material manager to create a material, double click on the material, and what I'll do is I'll make this a little bit brighter. And I'm going to delete the default specular and add a backman maybe. Let's add some layer Fresnel. I'm going to change that to conductor and use maybe iron. And let's put this onto our net. And I'm also going to use the Nikomedia Scene Rig. So I'm going to insert that. And for this rig, which is available for 10 euros, and you might want to consider getting it. It's a really nice plugin for Cinema 4D, and these days I prefer it to the HDRI Studio Rig by Grayscale Gorilla because the renders seem to go a little bit faster here. So what I'm going to do in the Nikomedia Scene Rig is I'm going to background and floor, and I'll switch that floor off. We don't need that. Okay. We won't really see much unless we add global illumination, I think, but there is definitely too much reflection here, so I'm going to reduce the global reflection brightness, bring that specular brightness down, maybe reduce the reflection strength, add a tiny bit of roughness maybe. So something like this looks nice, I think. And in the Nikomedia Scene Rig, I'm going to go to the HDRI settings, and by default it is a bit dark. I'm not sure if we can see anything yet. It doesn't make a difference until we add global illumination. But what I actually wanted to do was add a little bit of reflection blur. Maybe even a little bit more. Okay, something like this. I'm going to use the same texture for the collision sphere. I'm going to put that onto the sphere rather than the cloner. And let's copy that. And let's open the first one. I'm going to call this the base color. And the second one will be stripe, and I'll call this one stripe blue. And what I'm going to do here is in the color channel I'm going to add a gradient, and I'm going to switch that gradient to 2DU is okay, I think. I'm going to copy this white knot and move it over. We need to switch that to 2DV, and let's also copy the black knot, and then I'll just move these around and try to try to move them so they're about in the middle or at the center of that sphere. Something like this looks okay, I think. Maybe we could make this a little bit less wide. What I'll do is I'll copy that a gradient and put it in the alpha channel. I need to copy the entire texture from the color channel and put it there. Okay, and let's go ahead and invert the alpha channel. Maybe let's do this. And in the color channel, let's go back to the gradient, and I'm going to change the black color to something bluish. Delete this one, copy this knot. Okay, so maybe something like this. And I'm going to put this texture onto the net sphere, and now we have something like this. And this could be a little bit darker, I think. So let's do something like this maybe. And again, I'll just delete this knot here and copy this one. Okay, cool. And let's make a copy of this. And this is going to be my stripe red. And for this one, I'll just change the color in the color channel to, let's give it a nice bright red. Okay, and I'll put this on the collision sphere. So let's see how that looks. Okay, looks nice, I think. And the last thing I want to do is add global illumination. And for this, I'm just going to stick with the default settings here. Let's do a quick render. Okay, and this is pretty much what I used for the example I showed you at the beginning of this tutorial. And this animation took about 30 or 35 minutes on my PC to render in full HD. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.